you folks for coming in today. We're going to continue our discussion on term limits in Michigan. As you recall, yesterday we discussed a resolution. We discussed a resolution to have an Article 5 convention of the states that would amend the Constitution to enact congressional term limits. Today, we will take up issues relating to Michigan legislative term limits and our law here within this state. On our agenda, we have HJRV, HJRW, HJRX, all sponsored by Representative McBroom. If you'd like to come forward. But I want to make sure that those wishing to testify today know that I'd like to give a little latitude on the discussion to the broader issue or potential proposals versus taking testimony on individual resolutions. So with that, we will begin. Good morning, Rep.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Elections Committee. Thank you very much for taking up these joint resolutions. I have a lot of different things to say about where the state of the Michigan legislature is with term limits, and believe that these three resolutions provide us with a great opportunity to have a broader discussion on whether to keep term limits or to modify them or to eliminate them altogether. In my time here, and several of you came in with me in my class in 2011, and so we're all leaving soon. You recognize that term limits in Michigan have had over almost 25 years now, and that we can see a definite impact that they've had on the House of Representatives in particular. And I believe most of that impact has been very bad. I believe it's been bad for the institution, and that it's been bad for the people of the state of Michigan. Term limits in Michigan have really diminished the integrity of the institution. They have diminished the role of the rules. They have diminished the understanding of the rules. They've led to common practices of cutting corners becoming understood by members that, well, this must be the rules because this is the way we're doing things. One prime example of that is another resolution that I've introduced, and that deals with immediate effect. And so we see a lot of various things, the reading of bills on second reading and the handling of amendments. And if you spend time talking to members who served prior to term limits or shortly after term limits were adopted, they will explain to you in great detail just how different the procedures and the following of the rules have become within the House of Representatives. Michigan's term limits are the strictest term limits in the country. And I want to be clear that I'm not, really wed to one of these three resolutions I've introduced being the only one. I would be fine with any serious reform or repeal. Any of those three to me are acceptable because the status quo is not acceptable. You may see in some analysis that other states adopted term limits around the same time Michigan did. It was a popular movement nationwide, and Michigan's amendment was very similar to ones adopted in other states, and oftentimes were driven by the notion of the federal side of things. And Michigan's term limit initiative also applied federal term limits. That section was subsequently found unconstitutional. Other states that adopted them, such as California, Arkansas, Missouri, have all subsequently changed theirs, or states like Oregon have subsequently found their state term limit laws, which were the same as Michigan's, to be unconstitutional. Yet Michigan's has not had to face a legal challenge and has not faced a significant reform movement either. I think that the time has come that we give the people of the state of Michigan the opportunity to say whether or not they want term limits to continue the way they are, remove them, or offer opportunity for repeal. So what I would suggest with the three options I've put there, or if you can find some other options that you like better, or if you'd like to amend these, that's fine too. But I suggest that we put 2 or 3 of these before the voters at a general election and offer them the opportunity to have a referendum on the issue. Do they want to keep it? Do they want to remove it? Do they want to reform it? And if you read our Constitution, you'll see that when an issue goes on the ballot that affects the same section, whichever one receives the most votes beyond a majority would become the new law. Some of the things that I see particularly problematic with term limits in Michigan, beyond the institutional integrity, is the inability to, for members to function without additional political pressures. And what I mean by that is when I should start, I suppose, by saying what term limits have done, one of the impacts they've done to the House is really entrench power into the hands of leadership. And as a member who knows that at best you will only have 6 years of service, and if you're fortunate to even be in the majority, but even, and I don't speak from experience from this, but from talking to other members, you see that whether you're in the majority or minority, if you're not in a leadership position, when an issue comes forward for a vote that you don't agree with your leadership's position on, if you want to really push back and say, we shouldn't go this way, I want to fight this, and the leadership comes to you and says, you know, if you make too many waves about this, if you don't at least be a quiet no, then you can lose committee assignments, you can lose the opportunity for other bills to get hearings, you can be relegated to virtual insignificance for the remainder of that term. Prior to term limits, if you had to do that, if you had to really push your freedom that far, and you lost those rights during that term, it was okay because you knew that you would have another opportunity at a later date. The next time around, you gamble on a different leadership team, and you work until you get that chance. But with term limits, your opportunities to make that gamble are very, very limited. And you know that you could be relegated to insignificance for the 2 terms of that person's leadership, and then you're not here anymore. And you have just relegated your entire agenda and your opportunity to work for your district to virtual insignificance. And so it applies an additional level of political pressure on a person's freedom of conscience because of term limits, because of the shortness especially of term limits in Michigan. Just how short are term limits in Michigan when you think about it compared to what did we really need to do? I'm from the Upper Peninsula. We had Jacob Eddy, the Godfather, the guy who lived in this room. And when term limits were talked about in Michigan back in the 90s, I remember everybody was using Jacob Eddy as the poster child for why we needed term limits. He'd been there too long, 40 years, and Joe Mack almost as long, and those guys were talked about a lot. But even with those members at 30 to 40 years, the average time of service in the Michigan House of Representatives was less than 10 years. And so you can see even with that high number pulling the average up, the average was less than 10. And yet what was the maximum turnover in recent history? What was the maximum new class, incoming class? 1978, our clerk Gary Randall's class, 11. 11 new people was the biggest incoming class. And yet today, what do we see for incoming classes? 40, 60 people. And what do we get from having a huge influx of new people every 2 years? We can get dramatic swings in ideology. We can look at what happened in recent history. And I'm not trying to be stepping on any toes or be partisan, so I don't take it that way. But my class comes in, we're very unhappy with what Governor Granholm had done for her 8 years. And we said, boy, we're going to fix all of that. And we came in and we passed a lot of laws, a flurry of activity. And you move forward with that, and then when that changes, if there's not stability, you have, it's going to swing back the other way. So you look back just a little further. 06, what happened? the Republicans lost control and it went to the Democrats. And boy, we can't believe what they've been doing, so we're going to swing over here. But it's not just the swings of the partisan ideologies, it's the fact that there's no tempered view. There's no experienced view to temper what we're going to do. And there's also the outlook that says, I've only got a couple of years to impact change. Not only might we not be in majority next time, but I might not even be here the next time we're in majority. So we've got to do it right now. No holds barred. We don't have to work with anybody because they're not going to be here in a couple of years either. So we lose the building of relationships, we lose the continuity, and we are just, I think, diminishing in effectiveness more and more in the Michigan House. As I've looked at other legislatures around the country, and I can't say that I've looked at all of them by any means, so this is not an authoritative statement. But as I've talked with members from other places and seen how their places, how their legislatures work, I think it's safe to say at this point, from those that I understand, we're probably one of the most dysfunctional legislative houses in the country. And I think it's mainly due to the shortness of our term limits. It's due to the empowering of a few people in leadership roles on either side of the aisle, keeping members from being able to freely function, build relationships with each other, and to temper their ideological perspectives with experience. When you come in and all you have is your ideology, that's how you choose to vote. But after you've been here a few years and you see how some of those votes impact, was it a good thing? Should we do more of it? Was it not such a good thing? Should we do less of it? Did we do a lot of things for one particular side of society, whether it's business or labor or education or agriculture or manufacturing? We pass a group of bills, we need to give them some time. We need to let the dust settle, see if that's working. But when we are gone in such short order and a new group is in who doesn't know what we just did a couple years ago, they're very susceptible to the pressures of any of those enterprises within society to go for another one. Let's go at that again. Let's push further on that, or let's remove that was just done. And so there's no tempered experience that shapes the policy making. And so I'm fully in support, as you can tell, that we do something about term limits in Michigan. I believe that they are having a very detrimental effect on the stability of this state, and especially on the House. The Senate, I believe, is a slower descent because most of those members at least are there with some level of experience, mostly from the House. But I believe that descent will occur for them too. When you look at 2011, what dramatically changed in this legislature that hadn't happened before? Every single person who is now serving in the legislature and has since 2011 served post-term limits. Prior to 2011, there were members within the legislature who had served pre-term limits because they were allowed to come back. If they hadn't been termed out before they left office in '92, they were allowed to come back and serve under current term limits. When we started, when all of us who are in this room have never served with somebody who served prior to term limits. And I think that has just further changed the dynamic here. And one last example I can give you is my experience as chairman of the House Oversight Committee. The House Oversight Committee, if you take time to interview those who've chaired it in the past or who served in the past, they'll talk to you about what an important and powerful committee that was in its role of watching the departments, watching over the departments, keeping them from running roughshod with regulations, bureaucratic red tape, being sneaky with legislation. The Oversight Committee was a key component of that. And it lost that. It lost a lot of that, and I've studied the minutes and the journals from the past. I've interviewed people who chaired the committee in the past, even back before term limits, because I wanted to make that committee functional again. I wanted it to be restored to what it could do. But it hasn't been an easy thing to do. But it was shocking to see how much of that has changed. And that's probably the final thing about term limits that I notice is the bureaucrats and the lobbyists around here, they just wait because they outlast all of us. We're the people elected to represent the people of the state. And yet, when I've had departments literally say that, well, we'll just outlast you. We'll just outlast what you're trying to do. We'll still be here when you're gone. We're being made ineffective. We're relegated to being ineffective. And so I believe that's another critical reason why Michigan has struggled with regulations, why we're one of the most heavily regulated states in the country, is because these rules promulgate themselves. Legislators don't know because they don't have the experience to know how much has changed, what was different just a couple of years ago. So I think, like I said, I believe we should offer the voters a referendum on this. We should submit to them 2 or 3 options to choose from and give them the chance to say, and this would be on the ballot in 2018, has it been good for Michigan or not? Now, I'd like to let you know that I've been working on substitutes. They weren't quite ready yet. It's complicated amending the Constitution to make sure that this would not apply immediately to any of us currently serving. I believe that's important to make sure that we provide the voters with the opportunity to know that we're not just doing this for us, that it's not just helping our political careers, but that we're truly doing it because it's better for the state of Michigan, that they can make that decision with that clear sight. So I'm sorry the subs aren't quite ready yet. Like I said, it's been rather complicated working on constitutional language for this. I guess at that point, Madam Chair, I'd be happy to take any questions from you.
Thank you, Representative McBroom. Are there questions? Okay. Representative Hoadley.
I actually don't have a lot of questions. I just wanted to say I've appreciated serving with you, and I appreciate your perspective on this in terms of being willing to go and look at the long view. You always do your homework, and I just wanted to say thank you. I'm happy to, I think I've co-sponsored a couple of these. And just to be clear though, so if we were to vote all of these out, we would have 3 options on the ballot. So depending on the order of what they're voted out would essentially determine, like, you know, A, B, or C, the 1, 2, 3 on the ballot, something like that. And then the one with the highest vote total would be the one that we adopt, or if people vote no on everything, things would just stay the way they are?
That's correct. And I should say it's not whichever one gets the highest vote total, it's the highest one that gets over majority.
Got it.
So I mean, if they all fall less than 50%, that's failure too.
Okay. Nope, that's all. Just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. Representative Irwin.
I don't have a question. I just want to make a very brief statement in support of HGR V and W. Those are the 2 of the 3 that I think are probably the best policies and also most likely to garner the support of the citizens. I think that the idea of putting 3 forward and just kind of like a pick-em to the voters is somewhat problematic, because I think that every one you add is going to detract from all the others. And also, you know, our ballots are likely to be very, very long in 2018. You know, this may be hopeful to some, but, you know, we had long lines at many polling places. And, you know, when you're out there trying to encourage people to stay in line, they're waiting for 2 hours, and they got to pick up their kids, and they got to get to work, and they're going to miss their opportunity to vote. That's pretty frustrating. And so, you know, anyway, I don't want to load up the ballot with a bunch of stuff that's unlikely to pass. And personally, I think that of all of them, the one that really I think is the one that I think the public would rally behind would be W. You know, I think you know, just kind of taking our current term limits and merging them and giving folks a little more flexibility would be an easier message than repealing them altogether. So thank you for the opportunity. I said I was going to be brief, but I wasn't.
May I ask a question?
Please.
I
Yes.
mean, so 3 was too many, would 2 be? I mean, or you only want to do 1?
Madam Chair, I think one's the best choice. I think that if the legislature is going to put something on the ballot, we should come together and, decide which one's the best and put that out there. That's my preference and my urging, but you know how much juice I have. But, I think that all your points were right on about the damaging elements of term limits. I just think that if we're going to do any of these, we should really come together around one. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Driscoll.
Again, I would also say I enjoyed working with you, and I appreciate you bringing these forward. In my first term, I'm in my second, so in theory, could have a third term, but not right now. I did the Build Fellowship. I know some of us have done that, and we were with 13 other states, and I know I think we're one of 2 states with the shortest term limits in the country, and it's clearly coming from local government service for 20 years and really seeing the trends in the state and looking from that's my kind of style of governing, is really looking past and future trends. It has been really disconcerting to be here and not see a long-term view as clearly through legislative policy. So I appreciate that. I guess one thing that I've talked to people about in coffees and around the state and just other states, part of the Build Fellowship is learning what other states do well and modeling. And I know one conversation that's come up is a part-time or hybrid legislature. And I was wondering if you had talked or thought about that at all in conjunction, coming from being in, I've had 2-year terms for my whole career as a public servant, and I introduced with staff for our strategic planning for our community, we had 2-year terms, everybody did, so half our council was up and mayor every year. So we tried to introduce changes, so I think this could be something that some constituents are going to, as you know, I know you said it would affect future legislators, which I think is fantastic. I think that will help with that argument. But I know there's a lot of discussion out there about part-time versus full-time versus hybrid. And have you thought or talked about that at all in conjunction with this introduction?
Sure,
Thank you.
and Representative and Madam Chair, I could sit around for hours, and Jeff and I have, Representative Irwin and I have at times to just think about fundamentals of government, and so I have done a lot of thinking about that, and I would just in brief tell you, I'm supportive of part-time legislature, although I think if we had a part-time legislature with our current term limits, that would be an even bigger disaster. So I would love to see a part-time legislature, but not under current term limits. I think that would be awful. I do think that, there's a lot of options that could be discussed about ways we could do things differently, and I would certainly be open to suggestions on these. I think some things that could be very important. You talk about Dominic Jacobetti and his service here. Well, should he have really chaired this, in this room, the Appropriations Committee, for all of those years? That was really the bigger part of the angst and the animosity felt around the state. And so we could easily make some much broader institutional changes that say, well, look, we make these changes to term limits, but we're also going to say you can't be the chair of this one committee the entire time you're there. You can't, and we could do a lot more detailed type reforms like that. I'm trying to keep it simple and move one step at a time. Part of the problem with term limits, again, is I won't be here to kind of move forward with each of those implemented steps that I think we need to make the government function better. But yes, I have thought about a lot of those options, and if you feel like Madam Chair, if you want to make an amendment to say, hey, we're also going to include this thing about committee chairmanships in there, I'm fine with that. I think those are good ideas that I'm supportive of. I want to also add that, because I think this will come up from a friend I see in the audience, several have told me over the years, they're like, well, if it weren't for term limits, you wouldn't be here, Representative. And I think that's very true. And you know what I say? That would be great, because there'd probably be somebody better than me here who had been here for a while and did a better job, and I could still be at home milking cows and teaching school. Quite honestly, part of the reason I ran was because I felt like there was a desperate need for somebody to stand up. But you know what also is happening in Michigan? Because of these short term limits, we go to the barrel all the time. We are constantly going back to find another person to run. And what has that led to? We had 2 members who one was expelled and one was almost expelled. We've got another member in prison. We have had we've got vacancies upon vacancies going on, and the Constitution of our state calls for there to be 110 people serving. Not serving their individual districts, but serving all the people of Michigan. The people of Michigan are supposed to have 110 representatives. But term limits lead us to going back and again and again and again, and the more often you have to go out there and pull in, the more likely you are to get more problems more often. I mean, that's just simple statistics. And so on top of all of the other instabilities we have, look at what it's doing to us in that area as well. So yeah, I'm fine with the idea that I wouldn't have been elected if we didn't have term limits. It wouldn't be a problem to me. I would hope the people of my district would have somebody who'd been serving them for a number of years and doing a great job.
Thank you. Representative Lighthizer.
Thank you, Rep. McBroom. Have you, in studying this, drawn any parallels with the with campaign finance? Obviously, with more elections, more fresh faces, there's more funds required to introduce people to the electorate and so forth. Have you seen correlation in states that have gone away from term limits or softened them? And
that is a great question, Rep. Lighthizer, and I could only speculate on that because I have not done study to see the states that have gotten rid of their term limits or have modified them, how that affected campaign finance. That would be very interesting, and I'm sorry I never thought about doing that.
Thank you. I have a couple questions. The resolutions address legislative term limits, yet we do have term limits for governor, lieutenant governor, secretaries of state, attorneys general. Do you believe, in the absence of those being included in your resolutions, do you believe those term limits on those offices are sufficient? Yet, while on the other hand, we have other statewide boards that are not term limited. So I guess maybe why the focus specifically on the legislature?
I've thought about doing a more broad approach. I wanted to stay narrowly focused, provide as simple an opportunity for the people to speak on this issue. And I believe if you look at, let's say, the governor's office or even Secretary of State, in Michigan, there was usually fairly frequent turnover until very recent. Now the AG's office is obviously different because of Attorney General, the eternal Attorney General that we had for a long time. But typically governors didn't serve that much longer except for Mr. Milliken. And so I just wanted to focus on where I felt like the biggest negative impact has been felt. And that's on the legislature. Now, you can talk about State Board of Education and other things, and why didn't we term limit them? I don't know, but.
Thank you. And then my last question is, we see locally, especially in my county, we've had 2 local petition drives to enact local term limits, and they're passing. There's polling data that shows U.S. term limits for congressional offices are widely popular. How do you explain kind of the dichotomy with the negative consequences that term limits has seemed to bring upon the legislature with the popularity of term limits among our public?
I think that, in my experience, that term limits for the Michigan legislature have been diminishing in that popularity. I even have elementary kids, 3rd, 2nd graders, asking me when I go visit their classes about term limits and saying, well, don't you have elections to take care of that? I mean, so I think that the people of Michigan, when it comes to the legislature, if they've been paying attention, are recognizing the problems that it's been creating. But I won't dispute with you that even within Michigan, there's a sentiment about congressional. I believe that, just as it was back in '92 when Michigan passed its term limits and the congressional issue was on the ballot in that point too, that people are fed up with Congress and fed up with what's going on, but they only have the ability to impact their legislator. And term limits provide them with an opportunity to stick it to everybody else and say, we'll help everybody else throw their bum out too. Mm-hmm. And it becomes kind of think, a de facto shortcut. And I think that this country, if it were to enact short-term limits, like we have in Michigan, would rue that day eventually, like we are here in Michigan. Now, it doesn't mean we can't have some length of them. Personally, I feel like elections serve as their own term limits, okay? I mean, I'm a purist about that. But if we're going to have them, and you look at states where they're working okay, they're significantly longer. Don't make them so short. So I think there's that dichotomy there. I definitely sense, the frustration, even in my district, at the federal level. But if you look at how it plays out, I think you realize that you are just inviting a new problem. It really creates its own new problem. We're experiencing that here in Michigan, and I would hope that Michigan could be a leader in the discussion, if it ever comes up nationally, to say, be careful what you wish for. And be careful, don't do it like we've done it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate your insight and your willingness to bring the resolutions before this committee today. At this time, there are no further questions for you.
Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Rep. McBroom.